We are in Sweetbriar, Virginia, which is a tiny little town in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains on the campus of Sweetbriar College, which is a small private college for women. I am actually sitting in the dining room of my house. Just to my right is our living room where I write on a big old table that's propped up on some file cabinets.
Now, I know you're not originally from Sweetbriar. You've lived all over the world, New England, spent some time in Hong Kong, in England. How has living in so many different places influenced you as a writer, do you think?
Well, my husband is from New Orleans, born and raised in New Orleans, and lived there until he was in his mid-20s, and he's also a novelist, and everything he's written is set in New Orleans. All my work really ranges over a very broad geographic area. It ranges in terms of time, ranges in terms of characters. I think I've never lived anywhere as long as I've lived in Sweetbriar. I have yet to write a Virginia novel or a novel set in Virginia. But I think maybe because I moved around a lot as a kid, maybe writers are always sort of searching for some way to come in from out of the cold, always trying to find their way into a new place. And that may explain, at least in part, I guess, why my stories seem to be set in so many different locations. And I've lived in so many different places.
Do you have a favorite location from one of your books or stories?
My last novel, my most recent novel, is set in the Vermont countryside, and I have a particular fondness for that landscape, that kind of New England landscape. Something about the way the land is folded and the way you can see through little valleys to the next valley. In Virginia, the spaces are, of course, much bigger and much more wide open. But something about that Vermont landscape, that New England landscape, feels maybe more like home to me than anywhere else. One of my novels is also set in England, in a little village in England, and somebody once said to me that the place where you are living when your brain, as you're growing up, moves from understanding things moment by moment to narrative, to understanding things or remembering things narratively, that's the place where you feel most connected, because suddenly you can piece together memories that are not just single snapshots, but you can tell a story about your past. And I feel pretty connected to England as well, and also that particular period in time, the kind of late 1960s.
You said in an interview that some of your stories arise out of places both real and imaginary. Can you expand on that for me?
Well, I'm actually writing about a character right now who is a very active dreamer. She dreams very vividly and remembers her dreams all the time, and she makes a nuisance of herself with her husband, who finds the long recitation of all of these pointless events boring. And my husband has teased me some about talking to him about my dreams, remembering the kinds of details from dreams that might seem completely unimportant, but yet were very vivid to me. There is something about the imagined landscape, the landscape that just kind of crops up in your mind somehow, a place that you can see even though you've never been there, that it just won't leave you alone. And maybe because I dream that way, maybe because I see things architecturally in my dreams, I see the plant life, I see, the colors of the walls. I don't know. They feel, that's just how my brain works.
I want to ask you about one of the places in a story of yours that I love, A Splendid Life, which was originally published in one story. You write so beautifully about this lake, this home that's on this lake, and Did you live on a lake at some point in your life, or is there some connection that you have to lakes?
I've never lived by a lake, but I think they're very mysterious places. There's a beautiful small lake on the campus at Sweetbriar, and it's one of my favorite walks to walk around that lake. There's something about, what is it? Because things are reflected in the surface of the lake, or they seem depthless in some ways. They're places of great mystery, I think, lakes. And they kind of remind you of, the great geological happenings of the world, too. That lake wouldn't be there if there weren't hills around it. And there's just something kind of magnetic about them.
You just mentioned again that you teach at Sweetbriar College. Why do you teach? Besides making some money.
Well, there is, of course, the practical. Yeah, you have to make some money. There aren't very many writers, of course, who can afford not to do something else. And many of them teach for, all the obvious reasons. You get a long break in the summer. And having worked in other kinds of jobs, I can say that teaching is effortful in completely different ways than, I don't know, being a waitress or being a journalist. I worked... it was a very different kind of pace, I think, being a journalist. I have discovered that the thing I like the most about teaching, I'm not actually very comfortable in front of a big audience the way many, I think, really wonderful teachers are. They're kind of, they love being in the spotlight there, and I'm not one of those people who likes that. But I am astonished, actually, at what students have to say about stories. And I can bring a story to class, introduce a student to a writer, and it's just a kind of marvelous thing to watch somebody fall in love with a story. You feel a little bit like, you've been holding a party all by yourself somewhere, and suddenly somebody else bursts in the door and says, "Oh, I want to share this party with you." And that, to me, has been a real pleasure. Maybe because, and academics, I think, also are, I don't know, it's kind of a lonely job being an academic. It seems strange because, you're surrounded by people all the time, but because I compare it to having worked in a newsroom and worked at a newspaper when everybody was in the newsroom and it was kind of a fishbowl and you could never get away from people, the world of academia feels very lonely to me by comparison. And I think that watching somebody fall in love with a story that you too love is a kind of, I don't know, it's an antidote against some of that loneliness, maybe.
I used to work in a newsroom as well, and I certainly remember the pace and the frenetic activity, but the community that you get from being in a newsroom and that collaborative rush. But at the same time, when the you-know-what hits the fan, you need to get your work done, you kind of just focus, you're at your keyboard, and I'm assuming in a lot of ways that's very similar to what you're doing now. But what's the big difference, or what are the similarities, maybe there aren't differences, for you between the writing that you did before as a journalist and the writing that you do as a novelist and a fiction writer now?
Well, one of them is true, of course. That's probably the most obvious difference between the two. And this from working in a newsroom, you don't get too much time to revise when you're working on a newspaper. It's a good discipline, I think. Actually, it's a good discipline for writers to work as journalists for a while. That kind of deadline approach to writing can teach you that, if nothing else, you can do it if somebody holds a gun to your head. But I think that's probably the biggest change, really, is that, the fiction writer has the luxury to be able to go back and revise it and revise it and revise it. And that process of discovery of what the story is, as opposed to just, I don't know, quickly trying to catch it in your hand, that's a very different process. It feels to me all the time when I'm writing that I'm trying to get the characters to kind of turn around and look at me, so I can sort of look into their eyes and see them. And I think it can take a long time to do that. Whereas if, you go out to interview somebody, there they are. And they may be evading you in some ways, but they're fully present before you. And that's not the case with people that you're just making up.
Who's more willing to talk in the end, do you think? Real people or imaginary ones?
I think it depends on the person. Now we are going to be interrupted here.
I just have one more question, and then I'm going to let you go. Carrie, why are you a writer?
Ah, what an impossible question. Why am I a writer? Well, I don't seem able to not be a writer. Sometimes I wish I wasn't a writer. I bet lots of writers actually feel that way. You know, it's hard work in a weird kind of way. Somebody who is digging ditches for a living would roll their eyes at that, and probably rightly so. But it's I don't seem able to not do it, despite the other things that are happening in my life. I've raised children, and I've married, and I have a job and various kinds of commitments in my community. I seem to need to come back to that interaction with the page and an imagined world. And don't you think most writers feel that way somehow? They can't not do it.